My name is Dr. Marlene Kovac, and I never thought my life would take such a strange turn. I'm a marine biologist, someone who studies the mysteries of the ocean. For years, I've been fascinated by how nature works, how tides rise and fall, how creatures adapt to their surroundings. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened last summer. It all started when my son Jackson and I moved to Turnagain Arm, a remote stretch of coastline in Alaska. Jackson is 14, quiet but curious, and he has a rare condition called synesthesia. It means his senses are mixed up. He can see sounds as colors or feel music as shapes. He's always been special, but lately his condition had been getting stronger, almost overwhelming him. I thought moving to a quieter place might help. Turnagain Arm was beautiful but eerie. The tides there are some of the strongest in the world, rising and falling so quickly that they can trap you if you're not careful. The mudflats stretched for miles, gray, sticky, and dangerous. Locals warned us not to step on them. They said people had vanished there without a trace. We moved into an old research station near the coast. It was abandoned years ago but still had enough equipment for me to continue my work. Jackson loved taking pictures with his camera, so while I studied tidal patterns and marine life, he wandered around snapping photos of the mudflats and the strange glowing water at night. The first few days were peaceful enough. The air smelled fresh, and the sunsets painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. But then, things started to feel off. One evening, Jackson came running back from the shore with wide eyes. "Mom," he said breathlessly, "you have to see this." He showed me his camera screen. It was filled with photos of glowing patterns in the mudflats. They looked like symbols or shapes made of light. I frowned. "Are you sure these weren't reflections?" "No," he insisted. "They were moving on their own." I decided to check it out myself. As we walked toward the shore, the air grew colder, and I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. The mudflats shimmered faintly under the moonlight, like they were alive. "Don't go too close," a voice called out behind us. We turned to see Atka Nanook, an elderly woman from the nearby village. She had warned us about the mudflats before, but never explained why. "What's wrong with them?" I asked. Atka hesitated before replying. "The tides here are ancient," she said quietly, "and there are things in them that don't belong to this world." Jackson looked at her curiously. "What kind of things?" She didn't answer directly, but muttered something about spirits tied to the land and sea, beings that guard the boundary between them. I didn't believe her at first. It sounded like an old legend meant to scare newcomers. But that night, as I lay awake listening to the sound of waves crashing against the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The next morning brought more strange discoveries. Jackson's synesthesia seemed to be getting stronger. He said he could feel vibrations coming from the mudflats even when we were far away from them. And when I analyzed water samples from the glowing areas, I found traces of bioluminescent organisms unlike anything I'd seen before. Things only got stranger when Lieutenant Harrington visited us later that week. He was part of a local search and rescue team and had heard about my research station reopening. "Be careful out there," he warned me as we talked over coffee. "This place has a history." "What kind of history?" I asked. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Disappearances," he said grimly. "People who went out on those mudflats never came back." I felt a chill run down my spine but tried to brush it off as superstition or coincidence. Still, deep down, I knew something wasn't right. After Lieutenant Harrington left, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. Disappearances? What kind of people just vanished without a trace? I wanted to believe there was a logical explanation. Maybe they got caught in the tides or stuck in the mud. But something about the way he said it made my stomach churn. Jackson was acting strange, too. He spent more time by the mudflats, taking pictures and staring at the patterns in the glowing water. He told me he could hear something out there, like faint whispers or a low hum, but I didn't hear anything. "Mom," he said one evening as we sat in the small kitchen of the research station, "do you think there's something alive? In the mud?" I paused, unsure how to answer. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, looking down at his camera. "I don't know. It just feels like it's watching me." I tried to laugh it off. "It's just your imagination," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed that myself. The next day, I decided to take a closer look at Jackson's photos. At first, they seemed normal, shots of the shoreline, the mudflats, and the glowing water at night. But as I flipped through them, I noticed something odd. In some of the pictures, there were faint shapes in the background, humanoid figures made of light or shadows, barely visible but definitely there. "Jackson," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Did you see anyone out there when you took these?" He came over and looked at the screen. "No," he said quietly. "But they've been showing up in my pictures for days now." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Could it be a trick of the light? A camera glitch? Or was there really something, or someone out there? That evening, I decided to collect more samples from the glowing areas of the mudflats. Jackson came with me, holding his camera tightly as we walked toward the shore. The air was cold and still, and every sound seemed louder than usual. The crunch of our boots on gravel, the distant cries of seagulls. As we reached the edge of the mudflats, Jackson stopped suddenly. "Do you feel that?" he asked. "Feel? What?" I replied. He pointed toward the glowing water ahead of us. "It's like it's pulling me." I grabbed his arm instinctively. "Don't go any closer," I said firmly. We stood there for a moment, staring at the shimmering patterns in the mud. They seemed to shift and move on their own, forming shapes that almost looked like symbols or writing. My heart pounded as I realized they weren't random. They were deliberate. Suddenly, Jackson gasped and pointed his camera toward the horizon. "There," he whispered urgently. I followed his gaze and froze. In the distance, just beyond where the mudflats met, the sea, I saw them. Tall, shadowy figures rising from the water like they were part of it. They didn't move or make a sound. They just stood there, watching us. "Mom," Jackson whispered, his voice trembling. "What are those?" "I don't know," I said honestly, my throat dry. "We need to go back." We hurried back to the research station without looking back. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Were they real? Or had we imagined them? That night, Atka Nanook came by unexpectedly. She seemed worried and asked if we'd been near the mudflats again. "We saw something," I admitted hesitantly. Her face grew serious. "You need to stay away from them," she said firmly. "What are they?" Jackson asked. Atka hesitated before answering. "They're not human," she said finally. "They're part of this land, part of these tides. My people call them mud people. They've been here for centuries." I frowned. "What do they want?" "No one knows for sure," she replied softly. "But those who get too close, they don't come back." Her words sent a shiver through me. Could this really be happening? Was there something ancient and dangerous lurking in these tides? The next morning brought more questions than answers. When I reviewed my water samples under a microscope, I found organisms unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Tiny creatures that glowed faintly and moved in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. Jackson's condition was also getting worse. He said he could feel vibrations coming from deep within the earth whenever he stood near the mudflats, like some kind of energy was pulsing through him. And then there was Lieutenant Harrington. He stopped by again that afternoon with a grim expression on his face. "There's been another disappearance," he said quietly. "Who?" I asked. "A fisherman," he replied. "His boat washed up on shore this morning, but he wasn't on it." My heart sank as fear took hold of me. Whatever was happening here wasn't just strange. It was dangerous. The day after Lieutenant Harrington told us about the fisherman's disappearance, I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept going back to the shadowy figures we'd seen, near the mud flats. Were they connected to the glowing patterns in the mud? To the strange organisms in my samples? To Jackson's worsening condition? I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. Scared for my son. Scared for myself. Jackson, on the other hand, seemed almost drawn to whatever was happening. He spent hours staring at his photographs, tracing the shapes and patterns with his fingers like he was trying to decode them. "Mom," he said suddenly that afternoon, "I think they're trying to talk to us." I looked up from my notebook, startled. "What do you mean?" He pointed to one of his pictures, a close-up of the glowing mud. "These shapes, they're not random. They're like a language." I frowned. "Jackson, it's just bioluminescence. It happens naturally." "No," he insisted, shaking his head. "It's more than that. I can feel it." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to dismiss his idea as a kid's imagination running wild. But another part of me couldn't ignore how strange everything had been since we arrived. That evening, as the tide began to rise, I decided to take Jackson with me to collect more samples. I thought maybe if we faced whatever was out there together, we could figure out what was going on. We loaded our research vehicle with equipment and drove toward the shore as the sun set behind the mountains. The sky turned a deep shade of purple and the air felt heavier than usual. As we reached the edge of the mudflats, Jackson froze in his seat. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Look." I followed his gaze and felt my heart skip a beat. The figures were back, tall, shadowy shapes rising from the mud like they were part of it. But this time, they were closer. "Stay in the car," I said quickly, grabbing my flashlight. "No," Jackson protested. "I need to see them." Before I could stop him. He opened the door and stepped onto the gravel road. I hurried after him, my flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness. The figures didn't move or make a sound. They just stood there, watching us with an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. "Jackson," I said firmly, "we need to go back." But he didn't listen. Instead, he took a step closer to the mudflats and raised his camera. As he snapped a photo, something incredible happened. The figures began to glow faintly, their bodies shimmering with light that matched the patterns in the mud. "They're reacting," Jackson exclaimed. "Jackson, get back here," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. Before I could reach him, one of the figures moved, a slow, deliberate motion that sent ripples through the mud around its feet. It raised an arm-like appendage and pointed toward Jackson. For a moment, everything was silent except for the sound of waves crashing in the distance. Then Jackson gasped and stumbled backward. "Mom," he whispered shakily, I think they're talking to me." I grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the mudflats as fast as I could. We jumped into the car and sped back to the research station without saying a word. When we got inside, Jackson collapsed onto the couch, clutching his camera tightly. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. "What happened out there?" I asked urgently. He looked up at me with wide eyes. "They weren't trying to hurt me," he said quietly. "They were trying to show me something." "Show you? What?" I demanded. He hesitated before replying. "The tide. It's alive." I stared at him in disbelief. Alive? What did that even mean? As Jackson tried to explain what he felt, how the figures seemed connected to both the land and sea, I couldn't help but think about Atka's warning. They guard the boundary between land and sea. Was it possible these beings were part of some ancient ecosystem, something beyond human understanding? That night, as Jackson slept fitfully on the couch, I reviewed his photos again. In one of them, the one he took just before we ran, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The glowing patterns in the mud weren't random at all. They formed a symbol that looked eerily like an eye, watching us. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy rain pounding against the windows. The sky was dark, and the wind howled like it was trying to tear the research station apart. It felt like the whole world was warning us to stay inside. Jackson was sitting at the table, staring at his camera again. He hadn't said much since last night, but I could tell he was still thinking about what happened. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think they're trying to tell us something important." I sighed and sat down across from him. "Jackson, we don't even know what they are." "They're not bad," he insisted. "I can feel it." I wanted to believe him, but everything about this place felt wrong. The glowing mud, the shadowy figures, the disappearances. It was like we were caught in something much bigger than ourselves. Before I could say anything else, there was a loud knock at the door. I jumped up and opened it to find Lieutenant Harrington standing there, drenched from head to toe. "We need to talk," he said urgently. I let him in and handed him a towel. "What's going on?" He looked at me with a grim expression. "The tides are acting strange. They're rising faster than usual, and the currents are pulling boats off course." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means we might be dealing with something we don't understand," he replied. "And it's dangerous." Jackson spoke up suddenly. "It's them," Harrington frowned. "Them?" "The mud people," Jackson said simply. Harrington glanced at me like he wasn't sure if my son was serious or just imagining things. "He's not making it up," I said firmly. "We've seen them." Harrington shook his head in disbelief, but didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out a map of the coastline and pointed to a spot near the mudflats. "There's a spring tide coming tonight," he explained. "It's going to be one of the biggest we've ever seen. If those things are connected to the tides, they might show up again." I felt my stomach drop. A spring tide meant the water would rise higher than usual, and faster too. If we weren't careful, we could get trapped. "Why don't we just leave?" I asked. Harrington hesitated before answering. "Because if they're responsible for what's happening here, someone needs to figure out why." As night fell, the storm grew worse. The wind screamed through the cracks in the walls and the rain lashed against the windows like it was trying to break in. Jackson sat by the window with his camera while Harrington and I went over our equipment. Flashlights, radios, emergency supplies, anything that might help us if things went wrong. Atka Nanook arrived just before midnight carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She looked more serious than I'd ever seen her. "You shouldn't be here," she said bluntly. "We don't have a choice," Harrington replied. Atka sighed and placed the bundle on the table. When she unwrapped it, I saw a small wooden carving, shaped like a human figure covered in intricate patterns. "This is what my ancestors used," she explained softly. "It's meant to protect you from them." "From the mud people?" Jackson asked. Atka nodded solemnly. "They don't want to hurt us, but they will if we cross their boundary." "What boundary?" I asked. She pointed toward the mudflats on Harrington's map. "The place where land meets sea, that's their world." Around midnight, we heard it. The sound of rushing water growing louder and louder until it felt like it was right outside our door. The spring tide had arrived. Harrington grabbed his flashlight and motioned for us to follow him outside. The rain had stopped, but the air felt heavy and electric, like something big was about to happen. As we approached the mudflats, I saw them again, the shadowy figures rising from the glowing water like they were part of it. But this time, there were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, standing silently as the tide surged around them. "They're waiting," Jackson whispered. "For what?" Harrington asked nervously. Before anyone could answer, one of the figures stepped forward and raised its arm-like appendage toward Jackson again. The glowing patterns in the mud shifted and pulsed like they were alive. Jackson gasped and clutched his chest. "Mom!" he cried out in pain. I ran to him and held him tightly as his body trembled uncontrollably. His skin felt cold and damp, almost like mud, and his eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "What's happening to him?" I screamed at Atka. She looked at me sadly. "They've chosen him." "Chosen him for what?" Harrington demanded. "To join them," she replied softly. I held Jackson tightly as his body trembled in my arms. His skin felt strange. cold and damp, almost like the mud itself, and his breathing was shallow. The glowing patterns in the mud pulsed faster, brighter, as if they were alive and reacting to him. "They can't take him!" I shouted at Atka, my voice shaking with fear. Atka looked at me with sorrow in her eyes. "It's not up to us," she said softly. "He's been chosen." Harrington stepped forward, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "We're not letting them take him," he said firmly. "There has to be a way to stop this." The shadowy figures didn't move, but their presence felt heavier, closer, like they were surrounding us. The tide surged higher, creeping toward our feet as the glowing patterns in the mud shifted and twisted into shapes that looked almost like writing. Jackson groaned and clutched his chest. "Mom, I can hear them." "What are they saying?" I asked desperately. He looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes. "They want me to stay." "No," I cried, tears streaming down my face. "You're not staying. You're coming home with me." But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Whatever these beings were, whatever connection they had to the tides, they weren't going to let him go. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward, its body shimmering faintly in the darkness. It raised its arm-like appendage again and pointed toward Jackson. Harrington grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "We need to leave, now," he shouted. But Jackson shook his head weakly. "I can't," he whispered. "They won't let me." The glowing patterns in the mud pulsed faster, brighter, forming shapes that seemed to ripple through the air like waves. Jackson's body began to change. His skin darkened and cracked like dried mud, and his eyes glowed faintly with the same eerie light as the patterns. "No!" I screamed, holding him tightly. "You're not leaving me." Atka stepped forward and placed her hand gently on my shoulder. "Sometimes we have to let go," she said quietly. "I can't," I sobbed. Jackson looked up at me with tears in his glowing eyes. "Mom, it's okay." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "It's not okay." He smiled weakly and reached up to touch my face with his trembling hand. "I'll always be with you," he said softly. Before I could say anything else, the shadowy figures moved closer, surrounding us completely. The tide surged higher, pulling at our feet as Jackson's body began to dissolve into the mud. "Jackson!" I screamed, trying to hold on to him, but it was too late. He slipped from my arms and disappeared into the glowing patterns below. Harrington grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the mudflats as the tide rose higher and higher. Atka followed close behind, her face grim but calm. When we reached the research station, I collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. My son was gone, taken by something I couldn't understand or fight. Harrington sat down beside me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Atka knelt in front of me and held out the small wooden carving she had brought earlier. "Keep this," she said softly. "It will protect you." I took it without saying a word, clutching it tightly in my hands as tears streamed down my face. 6 months later, I left Turnagain Arm and returned to Seattle. The research station was abandoned again, just like it had been before we arrived, but even though I was far from Alaska, I couldn't escape what had happened there. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jackson's face, his glowing eyes staring back at me as he disappeared into the tide. And then there were the messages, the strange patterns that began appearing in tidal areas across different regions of the world. They looked just like the glowing shapes Jackson had photographed near the mudflats. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, a trick of nature, but deep down, I knew better. One evening, as I stood by the shore near my new home in Seattle, I felt a familiar vibration in my chest, the same heaviness I'd felt near Turnagain Arm. The tide shimmered faintly under the moonlight, forming shapes that looked eerily like symbols or writing. And then I saw him, Jackson's shadowy figure, rising from the water just beyond where land met sea. He didn't speak or move. He just stood there watching me with glowing eyes that seemed both human and otherworldly. I smiled through my tears as I stepped closer to the shore. "I'm coming," I whispered softly. My name is Thomas Harrington. I'm a wildlife photographer, though that's not what I used to be. I was a forest ranger once, but, well, let's just say something happened that made me leave that life behind. That's a story for another time. Right now, I've got my hands full trying to keep my family together. It was Rebecca's idea to take this trip. She thought it would be good for all of us. A healing trip, she called it. After all, things hadn't been great lately. My wife, Rebecca, is the strongest person I know, a nurse who can handle anything life throws at her. But even she was starting to crack under the weight of our family's problems. Our kids, Kyle and Emma, weren't exactly thrilled about spending their summer in the middle of nowhere, but we needed this. Or at least, that's what we told ourselves. We arrived at Whispering Pines Campground late in the afternoon. The place was beautiful. Tall pine trees that seemed to touch the sky, their needles forming a soft carpet on the ground. There was a chill in the air, unusual for this time of year, but it added to the charm. The mist hung low among the trees, giving everything an otherworldly feel. The campground host was waiting for us near the entrance. He was an older man with a nervous smile and hands that fidgeted constantly. "You folks picked a good spot," he said, handing me a map of the area. "But stay on the marked trails, all right? Don't wander too far." I nodded and thanked him, but his warning stuck with me. Something about his tone felt off. We parked. Our old Winnebago in the spot he'd recommended, a clearing surrounded by trees so dense they blocked out most of the sunlight. It was quiet out here, almost too quiet. As we set up camp, I noticed claw marks on some of the nearby trees. They were deep and jagged, like something big had been sharpening its nails. "Probably just a bear," I muttered to myself, though I didn't really believe it. Emma found something strange while exploring. A stuffed animal hanging from a tree branch. It was old and tattered, one eye missing and its fur matted with dirt. "Dad," she called out, holding it up for me to see. "This is creepy." I agreed, but tried to brush it off. "Maybe someone left it here a long time ago," I said, though deep down I felt uneasy. That night, we all had nightmares, identical ones. We were being hunted by something in the forest, something we couldn't see but could feel, closing in on us. When we woke up in the morning and shared our dreams over breakfast, Rebecca looked worried. "It's probably just this place," she said softly. "It's so isolated. Maybe our minds are playing tricks on us." Kyle's dog, Max, refused to leave the RV all day. He growled at nothing in particular and kept his tail tucked between his legs. That wasn't like him at all. Max was usually fearless. The final straw came when we found strange symbols circling our RV that morning. Symbols made from pine needles and stones arranged in intricate patterns. None of us had done it. We were sure of that. Rebecca looked at me with wide eyes as she whispered, "Thomas, what is going on here?" I didn't have an answer for her then, but I knew one thing for certain. Something wasn't right in Whispering Pines. The next morning, I decided to take my camera and head into the forest. I told Rebecca I wanted to photograph some wildlife, but honestly, I just needed to clear my head. Something about those symbols around the RV had shaken me, and I couldn't stop thinking about them. The forest was eerily quiet as I walked deeper into the trees. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching on pine needles. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I snapped a few pictures of the mist weaving through the trees and some strange rock formations covered in moss. They looked like they'd been carved by hand, rough symbols etched into their surfaces. Native American warnings, maybe. I wasn't sure. Then, as I adjusted my lens to focus on a distant clearing, something moved. It was tall, almost as tall as the trees, and impossibly thin. It darted between the shadows so quickly that I barely had time to register it. My hands shook as I snapped a few photos, hoping to capture whatever it was. Meanwhile, Rebecca had gone into town to pick up supplies and ask around about Whispering Pines. She's always been good at talking to people, getting them to open up. When she came back later that afternoon, her face was pale. "There's something you need to hear," she said quietly. She told me about a story the locals had shared. A story about the Wendigo winter of 1938. 7 families had disappeared from this area during an unseasonable cold snap, just like the one we were experiencing now. The only survivor was an old man who claimed they'd been taken by the Hungry One. No one believed him at the time, but no trace of those families was ever found. Rebecca's voice trembled as she added, "They said it only wakes up when someone disturbs its territory." I didn't want to believe her, but her words matched everything we'd been experiencing. The claw marks on the trees, the symbols around our RV, even Max's strange behavior. Later that day, Kyle and Emma wandered off together while Rebecca and I tried to figure out what to do next. They came back carrying an old leather journal they'd found in an abandoned ranger station nearby. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with frantic handwriting describing encounters with something called the Hungry One. One entry caught my attention. It mimics voices, creates illusions, separates its prey. My stomach churned as I read those words. As if things weren't bad enough, Walter Jenkins, the reclusive local everyone seemed wary of, showed up at our campsite just before sunset. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his eyes darting around like he expected something to jump out of the shadows. "You've been marked," he said bluntly, his voice low and gravelly. "You need to leave before the new moon." Rebecca asked him what he meant by marked, but he wouldn't explain further. He just kept repeating that we needed to leave immediately. That night, our RV broke down without warning. The engine wouldn't start no matter how many times I tried turning the key. It had been serviced just last week. There was no reason for it to fail like this. As we sat in silence trying to figure out what to do next, Kyle heard something outside. A faint sound like someone crying for help. "I'm going to check it out," he said before anyone could stop him. "Kyle!" Rebecca shouted after him as he disappeared into the mist. Minutes passed like hours as we waited for him to come back. When he finally did, he wasn't himself anymore. His skin was pale as snow, his eyes cloudy and distant like he wasn't really seeing us. He muttered something under his breath, words in a language none of us recognized, and collapsed onto the ground. Kyle lay on the ground, his breathing shallow and his skin cold to the touch. Rebecca knelt beside him, checking his pulse and shining a flashlight into his cloudy eyes. "He's alive," she whispered, her voice shaking. "But something's wrong. Thomas, he's not responding." Emma sat beside her brother, holding his hand tightly. "What happened to him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever had happened to Kyle wasn't natural. His muttering hadn't stopped. It was like he was chanting, in a language none of us had ever heard before. Rebecca tried to calm him down, but he didn't seem to hear her. I grabbed my camera and started flipping through the photos I'd taken earlier in the forest. My hands trembled as I looked at them. Every single picture showed the same thing. A tall, gaunt figure with antlers standing in the shadows, watching us. "It's here," I said quietly, my throat dry. "Whatever it is, it's been following us." Rebecca looked up at me, her face pale. "Thomas, are you saying this thing is real?" Before I could answer, we heard a sound outside, a low growl that sent chills down my spine. Max started barking furiously, his teeth bared as he stared at the RV door. "Stay inside," I said firmly, grabbing the hatchet we kept for chopping firewood. "Thomas, no," Rebecca pleaded. But I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever. was out there to come for us. I stepped outside into the misty darkness, my flashlight cutting through the fog. The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. Then I heard it, a voice calling my name. Thomas. It sounded like Rebecca, but I knew it wasn't her. She was inside with the kids. My heart pounded as I turned toward the sound, gripping the hatchet tightly. Thomas, the voice repeated, closer this time. The mist shifted, and that's when I saw it. The Wendigo. It was taller than any human should be, its skeletal frame covered in thin, pale skin that looked ready to tear apart at any moment. Its antlers stretched high above its head like twisted branches, and its glowing eyes locked onto me with a hunger that made my stomach churn. I froze in place as it took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate. It didn't need to rush. It knew I couldn't run. Then it spoke again, but this time in Kyle's voice. Help me. I stumbled backward into the RV and slammed the door shut behind me. Max barked wildly as Rebecca grabbed Kyle and pulled him into one of the bunks. It's out there, I said breathlessly. It can mimic voices. It knows how to trick us. Walter Jenkins appeared outside the RV window suddenly, banging on it with both hands. Let me in, he shouted desperately. Rebecca hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and letting him inside. He looked terrified, more scared than any man I'd ever seen before. It wants you, Walter said bluntly as he pointed at Kyle. You brought it back. What are you talking about? Rebecca demanded angrily. Walter explained in hurried whispers that the Wendigo had been dormant for decades but had awakened. Because of us. Because of me. He claimed it had something to do with my bloodline. That one of my ancestors had been its last victim during the Wendigo winter of 1938. You're connected to it, Walter said darkly. And now your family is marked. I felt sick hearing those words. It explained so much about why we'd been targeted since arriving here. Walter then revealed something even worse. He'd survived all these years by feeding others to the Atintu Wendigo, luring them into its territory so he could escape its wrath himself. Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. You've been sacrificing people? Walter didn't deny it. He simply nodded grimly. Before we could say anything else, the RV shook violently as something slammed against it from outside. The Wendigo was testing our defenses. We can't stay here, Walter said urgently. It'll get inside eventually. But before we could make a plan to escape, Walter lunged at Emma suddenly, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. She's young enough, he shouted desperately. If we give it her... Rebecca tackled him before he could finish his sentence, pinning him to the ground with surprising strength for someone her size. You're not touching my daughter, she screamed. The RV shook again as cracks began forming in one of the windows. The Wendigo was getting closer. The RV shook again, harder this time. A loud cracking sound came from one of the windows as the glass started to splinter. Rebecca was still pinning Walter to the ground while Emma stood frozen in the corner, clutching Kyle's hand. Max barked furiously, his hackles raised. We need to move, I shouted, grabbing Rebecca by the arm and pulling her away from Walter. Walter scrambled to his feet, his face wild with panic. You don't understand. It's going to kill all of us unless we give it what it wants. No one is being sacrificed, Rebecca snapped, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. The window shattered suddenly, and a long, bony arm reached inside. Its fingers were impossibly thin, like twisted branches, and its claws scraped against the walls as it searched for a way in. Emma screamed, and Max lunged at the arm, snapping his teeth at it. Everyone out, now, I yelled. Rebecca grabbed Kyle, who was still mumbling incoherently, and Emma followed close behind as we bolted out of the RV. The cold night air hit us like a slap in the face. The mist was thicker than ever, swirling around us like it had a mind of its own. Walter stayed behind for a moment, staring at the Wendigo's arm as if hypnotized. Then he turned to us and shouted, "You can't escape it. It'll never stop hunting you." Before we could respond, the the Wendigo's arm grabbed him by the neck and yanked him out of sight. His scream was cut short, leaving only an eerie silence behind. "Run!" Rebecca shouted. We sprinted through the forest, dodging trees and stumbling, over roots as the Wendigo's growls echoed all around us. It felt like it was everywhere at once, its voice calling out in different directions, mimicking our own voices to confuse us. "Emma! Over here!" I heard my own voice call from somewhere in the mist. Emma hesitated for a split second before Rebecca grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. "Don't listen to it," she said firmly. I remembered something Walter had said earlier about running water, that it couldn't cross it. If we could find a river or stream, we might have a chance. "This way," I shouted, leading them toward where I thought I'd seen a creek earlier that day. The growling grew louder as we ran. I glanced over my shoulder and saw it, tall and skeletal. Its glowing eyes locked onto us as it moved through the trees with unnatural speed. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized we weren't going to make it unless someone slowed it down. "Keep going," I yelled to Rebecca. "Get them across the water." "What are you doing?" she cried. "I'll distract it. Just go." Before she could argue, I turned and ran in the opposite direction, shouting and waving my arms to draw its attention. The Wendigo stopped for a moment, its head tilting unnaturally as it focused on me. Then it let out an ear-piercing screech and charged after me. I ran as fast as I could, weaving between trees and trying not to trip over roots. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way to trap it. Then I remembered. There was an old logging pit nearby that had been abandoned years ago. If I could lure it there, the pit was exactly where I'd remembered it. A deep hole surrounded by rusted equipment and rotting wood. I skidded to a stop at the edge and turned to face the Wendigo as it emerged from the mist. It moved slowly now, almost like it was savoring the moment. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine as it stepped closer and closer. My hands shook as I gripped the hatchet tightly. "Come on," I muttered under my breath. Just a little closer. At the last second, I jumped out of the way, and the Wendigo lunged forward, straight into the pit. It let out a deafening roar as it clawed at the edges, trying to pull itself out. I didn't wait to see if it would succeed. I ran back toward where Rebecca and the kids had gone. When I reached them at the creek's edge, they were already halfway across. "Hurry," Rebecca called out. I splashed into the icy water just as another roar echoed through the forest behind me. The Wendigo stood on the opposite bank now, its glowing eyes burning with rage as it paced back and forth, but didn't cross. We kept moving until we were far enough away to feel safe, if you could call anything safe after what we'd just been through. 6 months later, life seemed almost normal again, or at least as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. Kyle still had moments where he spoke in that strange language from time to time, but otherwise he seemed okay. Emma had changed somehow. She spent more time alone now, collecting plants that looked oddly similar to those symbols we'd seen around our RV that first night. One day, while cleaning out some old boxes in our garage, Rebecca found my camera, the one I'd lost during our escape. The film inside had somehow developed itself. When she showed me the pictures, my blood ran cold. There I was in every photo, but not how I remembered myself. My skin looked pale and stretched tight over my bones, my eyes glowing faintly like the Wendigo. That night, I woke up suddenly to find Emma standing over me in the dark. Her shadow stretched across the wall behind her, and for just a moment, I thought I saw antlers. My name is Dr. Lawrence Mitchell. I'm a cultural anthropologist, someone who studies traditions, stories, and rituals passed down through generations. But honestly, I wasn't sure what I was looking for anymore. After losing my wife last year, everything felt hollow. I decided to take my son, Peter, on a trip to the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. I told myself it was for research, documenting harvest folklore, but deep down, I think I just wanted to escape. Peter is 12 years old. He's quiet and sensitive, the kind of kid who notices things most people don't. Since his mom died, he's been having strange dreams. He says he sees shadows with glowing eyes watching him at night. I didn't know what to make of it, but I figured the fresh air might help him. We packed up our RV, a shiny old 1957 Airstream land yacht, and headed into the mountains. It was equipped with all my recording gear and notebooks, ready for interviews with locals about their harvest. Traditions. The Ozarks were beautiful but eerie, with thick forests that seemed to stretch forever and valleys so deep they felt like another world entirely. When we arrived in the small town at the base of the mountains, we met Abigail Turner. She was our guide, a tough woman in her late 30s who knew the area like the back of her hand. Her eyes had this sharpness, like she could see right through you. She agreed to help us find the isolated communities that still practiced old harvest rituals, but warned us about a place called the Hollow. "Don't go there," she said firmly. "It's not on any map for a reason." I laughed nervously and told her we'd stick to her advice, but something about her tone made me uneasy. Our first stop was a small cabin where an elderly couple lived. They were friendly enough, offering us sweet tea and homemade cornbread while they talked about the harvest moon that appeared every summer for 3 nights straight. They told us stories about the hungry ones who came out during harvest time, pale creatures that watched from the woods and took what they needed. Peter sat quietly during the interview, staring out the window at the forest beyond. When we got back to the RV that evening, he told me he'd seen something moving between the trees, something pale and dog-like. I brushed it off as his imagination. That night, strange things started happening. We found symbols drawn on the side of our RV, corn husks tied into intricate patterns and smeared with what looked like blood. My recording equipment picked up whispers and growls when no one was speaking. Peter woke up screaming from another dream about glowing eyes and the dark. The next morning, Sheriff Roy Donovan stopped by our camp after hearing about our visit from Abigail. He was a gruff man in his 50s with tired eyes that seemed to carry secrets he didn't want to share. "You folks need to be careful," he said, leaning against his patrol car. "Stick to the main roads and don't wander too far into those mountains, especially at night." I asked him if he believed in the stories about the hungry ones. He hesitated before answering. "Let's just say, there's a reason people don't go looking for trouble out here." As we drove deeper into the mountains with Abigail, leading the way, Peter started acting strange, quiet even for him, and kept glancing over his shoulder like he felt something watching us. I tried to focus on my work, interviewing locals about their harvest rituals and recording songs they sang during this time of year. One song caught my attention. It was hauntingly beautiful, but seemed to contain warnings hidden in its lyrics. Under amber light they roam. Keep your doors locked tight at home. That evening, as we parked our RV near a clearing surrounded by towering trees, Peter asked me something that sent chills down my spine. "Dad, do you think Mom can see us from wherever she is?" I didn't know how to answer him. Before I could say anything, Abigail interrupted us with a worried look on her face. "We shouldn't stay here long," she said quietly. "This place feels wrong." But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted answers about this mysterious folklore that seemed to haunt everyone we met. The next morning, Peter and I were packing up the RV when a local boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, wandered into our camp. He had messy hair and dirt smudged on his face, but his eyes were sharp and curious. "You're looking for stories, right?" he asked, tilting his head. I nodded, trying to keep my tone light. "That's right. Do you know any good ones?" Boy grinned, but it wasn't the kind of grin that made you feel at ease. "You should go to the Hollow. That's where the real stories are." Abigail froze when she heard him. "No," she said sharply. "They're not going there." The boy shrugged and ran off into the woods, leaving an uncomfortable silence behind him. I could see the tension in Abigail's face, but I couldn't let it go. Against her advice and my own better judgment, I decided we'd check it out. We followed the boys' directions down a narrow dirt path that twisted through the forest like a snake. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on dry leaves. Even Peter seemed uneasy, clutching his sketchbook tightly as he walked beside me. When we finally arrived at the hollow, it was like stepping into another world. The valley was surrounded by jagged rock formations that looked like they'd been carved by giant hands. In the center was a small community of wooden cabins, their roofs sagging under the weight of time. People moved about quietly, their faces pale and serious. Something felt off. We approached cautiously, and a man with a long beard greeted us with a nod. "You're just in time," he said in a low voice. "We're preparing for our Thanksgiving ritual." I asked him if we could observe and maybe record some of their songs or stories. He hesitated, but eventually agreed, as long as we didn't interfere. As we walked through the village, I noticed something strange. Every cabin had charms hanging over its door, bundles of herbs tied with red string or small wooden carvings shaped like animals. And when the sun started to dip behind the mountains, everyone hurried indoors and locked their doors tight. Peter tugged on my sleeve and pointed to one of the scarecrows standing in a nearby field. It wasn't like any scarecrow I'd ever seen before. It was too lifelike. Its arms stretched unnaturally long and its face covered with what looked like dried animal skin. "Dad," Peter whispered, his voice trembling. "They're watching us." I glanced around but didn't see anything unusual, just shadows stretching across the ground as the sun set. Still, his words sent a shiver down my spine. That night our RV broke down just as we were about to leave the hollow. The engine sputtered and died, no matter how many times I tried to restart it. Abigail cursed under her breath and muttered something about bad luck. "We'll have to stay here tonight," I said reluctantly. Abigail didn't argue, but I could tell she wasn't happy about it. As darkness fell over the hollow, an eerie stillness settled over the valley. The harvest moon rose high above us, huge and golden, casting an amber glow that made everything look surreal. While Peter slept fitfully in his bunk, I sat outside with my recording equipment, hoping to capture some of the villagers' songs from afar. Instead, I picked up something else, low growls and faint whispers that seemed to come from all around me. Then I saw it, a figure moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was too tall to be human and moved with an unnatural grace. My heart pounded as I fumbled with my flashlight, shining it toward the figure, but by the time the beam reached it, it was gone. The next morning, Peter told me he'd seen one of the villagers change under the moonlight. He described their limbs stretching unnaturally long and their face twisting into something that wasn't human anymore. "They're not people," he said quietly. "Not really." Abigail finally broke her silence after hearing this. "They're called dogmen," she said grimly. "Guardians of these mountains, or so they say." She explained that every year during harvest time, this community made sacrifices to these creatures to keep them from hunting freely in the forest. I didn't know whether to believe her or not, but everything we'd seen so far pointed to something beyond explanation. Later that day, I found an old ledger in one of the cabins, a dusty book filled with names and dates going back centuries. Strangely enough, none of these people seemed to age or leave this place. Generation after generation stayed exactly where they were. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a community. It was a pact, frozen in time. As we prepared to leave the hollow, after fixing our RV with help from one of the villagers, Abigail pulled me aside. "You need to get out of here before nightfall," she warned urgently. "They've already marked you." Before I could ask what she meant by that, Peter called out from inside the RV, his voice shaking with fear. "Dad, come look at this." I rushed inside and found him holding up one of his sketches, a drawing he'd made earlier that day while sitting outside. It showed our RV surrounded by shadowy figures with glowing eyes, figures that hadn't been there when he drew it. The air in the hollow felt heavier as the sun began to set again. The villagers were tense, moving quickly to finish their preparations for the ritual. They avoided looking at us, their eyes darting nervously toward the forest. Abigail was on edge too, pacing near the RV with her arms crossed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Peter stayed close to me, clutching his sketchbook like it was a shield. He hadn't said much since showing me that eerie drawing, but I could tell he was scared. As the harvest moon rose, higher in the sky, its amber light seemed almost alive, casting strange shadows that danced across the ground. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural howl that echoed through the valley. "What was that?" Peter whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, another howl joined the first, then another, until it sounded like a chorus of wolves surrounding us. But these weren't normal wolves. The sound was deeper, more resonant, like it came from something much larger. The villagers began their ritual in the clearing, singing an old folk song in unison. Their voices were shaky but determined as they stood around a massive bonfire. At first, I thought it was just part of their tradition, but then I noticed something horrifying. They weren't singing to celebrate the harvest. They were singing to keep something away. Abigail grabbed my arm suddenly, her grip tight. "We need to leave, now." "But the RV," I started to protest. "We'll walk if we have to," she snapped. "It's not safe here anymore." Before we could move, a figure stepped out of the shadows at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and hunched, its body covered in matted fur that shimmered strangely in the moonlight. Its face was a grotesque mix of human and wolf, elongated snout, sharp teeth glinting as it snarled. Peter gasped and clung to my side as more of them emerged from the forest, at least half a dozen creatures with glowing yellow eyes and movements. So fluid, they seemed almost unreal. The villagers froze mid-song, their fear palpable. One of them stepped forward, a frail old woman who looked like she might collapse under her own weight. "We have your offering," she said in a trembling voice, gesturing toward a small wooden altar near the bonfire. That's when I saw it, a bundle wrapped in cloth lying on the altar. It wasn't until Peter let out a horrified cry that I realized what it was. A child. "They're sacrificing people," Peter whispered, his voice barely audible. I felt sick to my stomach as one of the creatures approached the altar, sniffing at the bundle like a predator sizing up its prey. "No," Abigail said sharply, pulling me and Peter back toward the RV. "We can't stop this." But I couldn't just stand there and watch them sacrifice an innocent child. Not after everything we'd been through. "Stay here," I told Peter firmly before stepping forward. "Wait," Abigail hissed, but it was too late. I was already moving toward the bonfire. The creatures turned their glowing eyes on me as I approached, their growls growing louder. My heart pounded in my chest as I raised my hands in what I hoped was a calming gesture. "We don't want any trouble," I said shakily. "But this isn't right." The old woman glared at me with a mix of anger and fear. "You don't understand," she hissed. "If we don't give them what they want, they'll take all of us." Before I could respond, one of the creatures let out an ear-splitting roar and lunged toward me. But it stopped just short of attacking, its nose twitching as if it were sniffing me. Peter screamed behind me as another creature approached him from the shadows. But instead of attacking him, it stopped and tilted its head curiously. "They're not going to hurt him," Abigail said suddenly, her voice filled with both awe and dread. "They're drawn to him." "What are you talking about?" I demanded. She hesitated before answering. "Peter, he's sensitive to them, connected somehow. They see him as one of their own." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. These creatures weren't just hunting. They were looking for new members for their pack. The villagers started, panicking as more creatures emerged from the forest, their howls filling the air like a twisted symphony. Chaos erupted as some tried to flee while others begged for mercy. Sheriff Donovan arrived out of nowhere, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he yelled for everyone to get inside their cabins. "You shouldn't have come here." He shouted at me over the noise. "I didn't know," I yelled back helplessly. One of the creatures lunged at Donovan, knocking him to the ground before he could react. He fought back fiercely but was no match for its strength. "Go," he shouted at us as blood seeped from a wound on his shoulder. "Get out while you still can." Abigail grabbed Peter's hand and pulled him toward the RV while I helped Donovan back to his feet. "You can't save everyone," he said grimly before shoving me toward my family. "Protect your boy." We barely made it back to our RV before one of the creatures slammed into its side with enough force to rock it on its wheels. Abigail fumbled with her keys as Peter cried out in terror beside her. "Drive," I shouted once she got it started, and somehow, miraculously, the engine roared back to life. As we sped away from the hollow with howls echoing behind us, I glanced back at Peter sitting silently in his seat, his face pale but calm despite everything we'd just witnessed. Something about him had changed, and deep down, I knew this wasn't over yet. We drove as fast as the RV could handle, the narrow dirt road twisting and turning through the dark forest. The howls from the hollow echoed behind us, growing fainter but never fully disappearing. Peter sat silently in the back, staring out the window with wide eyes. Abigail gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white. "They won't stop," she muttered under her breath. "They never stop." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. She glanced at me briefly, her face pale and grim. "The dogmen don't just protect the mountains. They're bound to them. They can't leave, but they can still reach you. Once they've marked someone, it's only a matter of time." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. Peter had been acting strange ever since we arrived in the hollow. Quiet, distant, like he was hearing something none of us could. "Dad," Peter said suddenly, his voice soft but steady. "They're not chasing us." "What?" I turned to look at him. "They don't need to," he continued, his gaze fixed on the forest outside. "They already know where we're going." Abigail slammed on the brakes, bringing the RV to a screeching halt in the middle of the road. She turned to Peter, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean?" she demanded. "How do they know?" Peter didn't answer right away. He just stared at her with an expression that was far too calm for a 12-year-old boy. "They're calling me," he said finally. "I can feel it." I felt my stomach drop. "No," I said firmly. "We're not going back there." But Abigail shook her head slowly. "It's not up to us anymore," she said quietly. "They've chosen him." "No," I shouted, slamming my fist against the dashboard. "We're not giving him to them." Abigail looked at me with a mixture of pity and determination. "You don't understand," she said softly. "This isn't about what we want. It's about survival." Before I could argue further, Peter spoke again, his voice eerily calm. "It's okay, Dad," he said. "I know what I have to do." "No," I repeated, my voice cracking as tears filled my eyes. "You don't have to do anything." But Peter just shook his head and opened the door of the RV before stepping out into the night. Abigail and I followed him reluctantly as he walked into a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. The moonlight bathed everything in an amber glow, making it feel like we were standing in another world entirely. The dogmen were waiting for us. They emerged from the shadows one by one, tall, hunched figures with glowing yellow eyes and fur that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. They moved silently, their steps impossibly light for creatures so large. Peter walked toward them without hesitation, stopping just a few feet away from the largest one, a creature that towered over him, like a living nightmare. "Peter!" I called out desperately, but Abigail grabbed my arm and held me back. "Don't interfere," she whispered urgently. "It'll only make things worse." I watched helplessly as Peter stood before the creature, his small frame dwarfed by its massive size. To my surprise and horror, the creature didn't attack him. Instead, it tilted its head curiously and let out a low growl that sounded almost gentle. Peter reached out slowly and placed his hand on its chest. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the creature threw its head back and let out a long, mournful howl that echoed through the forest like a funeral dirge. The other dogmen joined in one by one until their howls filled the air completely. Abigail pulled me back further into the shadows as the creatures began circling Peter like predators sizing up their prey. "What are they doing?" I whispered frantically. "They're deciding," Abigail replied grimly. "Deciding what?" I demanded. "Whether to take him or let him go." I couldn't breathe as I watched them close in on my son. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the largest creature stepped forward and placed its massive hand on Peter's shoulder. Peter looked up at it calmly, almost knowingly, and nodded once before stepping back toward me and Abigail. "They've made their choice," he said simply. Before I could ask what he meant by that, Abigail grabbed my arm again and pulled me toward the RV. "We need to leave now," she said urgently. As we ran back toward our vehicle with Peter between us, I glanced over my shoulder one last time at the dogmen standing silently in the clearing under the harvest moonlight. They didn't follow us, but their glowing eyes stayed fixed on us until we were out of sight completely. Back in the RV, Abigail drove silently while Peter sat beside me with his head resting against my shoulder. I wanted to ask him what had happened back there, what he'd seen or felt, but something told me not to push him just yet. Instead, I wrapped my arm around him tightly and whispered softly, "We're going home." But deep down, I wasn't sure if that was true anymore. 3 months passed since we left the Hollow, but it never truly left us. Peter seemed fine at first, quieter than usual, but otherwise okay. I told myself he just needed time to process everything we'd been through. But then the small, strange things started happening. He stopped sleeping through the night. I'd find him awake, staring out his bedroom window toward the mountains in the distance. Sometimes I'd catch him whispering to himself, though when I asked him about it, he'd just smile and say he didn't remember. Then there were his senses. He could hear things no one else could, like the faint rustle of leaves outside or the hum of insects that weren't even visible. He could smell things, too, like rain before it fell or animals that had passed by hours earlier. At first, I thought it was just a heightened awareness from all the stress he'd been under. But one night, I woke up to find him standing in the hallway, his eyes closed and his head tilted as if listening to something far away. "Peter?" I called softly. He didn't answer right away. When he finally turned to look at me, his face was calm, but his reflection in the hallway mirror wasn't. It was stretched and distorted, with glowing yellow eyes staring back at me. "They're calling us home," he whispered before walking back to his room like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. A year later, I found myself driving back toward the Hollow without fully understanding why. Peter wasn't with me anymore. He had disappeared weeks earlier without a trace. My journal was filled with erratic notes and drawings of the harvest moon, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The last page of my journal had only one thing written on it: "The pack is waiting."